everybody, and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In today's video, I'm going to look at the UK Constitution, in particular changes that have been made to it since 1997. Now, some of these have worked, some of them haven't, some of them have been a great idea, some of them haven't, and we're going to have a look at a variety of kind of key questions on this, and also make sure we're covering all the necessary parts of the spec. This is part of my series on A-level politics, which I'll go through the entirety of the spec, or at least I'm working my way through the entirety of the spec. So hopefully this will be of use to all of you who are studying that. So, according to the spec, what do we need to know? Well, we need to know how the Constitution has changed since 1997, and this includes under Labour 97 to 2010, House of Lords reforms, electoral reforms, devolution, Human Rights Act and the Supreme Court. So we'll look at all of those. Under the Coalition, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and further devolution in Wales, and any major reforms undertaken by government since 2015, including further devolution in Scotland in the context of the Scottish referendum. And there's been some other bits and bobs as well, and so we'll look at those. So that's what the specification tells us. To me, there are three really big questions in this, and it leads to a debate that also I will look at in a future video. So three big questions. How far has the UK Constitution changed since 97? How likely are those changes made since 97 to stay in place? And is more change needed? And that will lead us to one of the big debates on this issue of the UK Constitution, which is, should we change it and get a codified one? The short answer to which is probably yes, but we'll look at both sides of that debate in a different video. But we'll keep coming back to these. So we'll look at the degree of change, which you could get a question on. We'll look at whether these things are actually successful. Are they going to stay in place? And we'll look again at this idea that things haven't gone far enough and they need to continually be changed. So what was Labour aiming to do 97 to 2010? Well, it was looking to modernise, to bring the Constitution up to date. It was looking at democratisation, increased participation, for example, use of referendums, get more local involvement, and also to remove some of the undemocratic elements of the system. They wanted decentralisation, so that, again, devolution and the enhancing of local government, and they wanted to safeguard and strengthen people's rights. So, how much of this have they done? Well, they definitely did the referendums bits. We saw in 97-98, we saw a series of referendums in Scotland, in Wales and in Northern Ireland. It's about whether people supported the creation of devolved institutions, and this led to a quasi-federal but asymmetrical system. And by that we mean it's not completely federal, because we still have parliamentary sovereignty, and so the power still remained in Parliament, although it gave or devolved some powers to these different institutions. It's not gone for good, and it's asymmetrical because the different countries in the UK got different things. So Scotland got more power than Wales. The systems and powers given to Northern Ireland were different again, and England didn't really get anything. We saw some stuff in London, the creation of the mayor in London and the London Assembly, but since 97 there's been a failure really to expand this much further. I mean, we've got elected mayors in places like Manchester and Liverpool, but we don't really have a system which is uniform. So in the United States, where we have a federal system, each state has the same rights as the other states, but that's not the case in the UK. So in Scotland, the devolution was largely aimed at preventing the growth of the SNP and cutting demands for independence. So that didn't work really. Yeah, so that bit failed. I don't think there's a huge amount of debate about that bit. So 74% of voters supported the creation of a Scottish Parliament. 63.5% of them supported it having tax-bearing powers. So they got a Scottish Parliament and it got tax-bearing powers. It also had control over health, over social services, over education, over culture and tourism and sport and criminal justice and agriculture and fishing, and local government and elections into those local government, and then in the referendum as well. They very famously they gave 16 and 17-year-olds a vote. So the Scottish Parliament has quite a lot of power from its inception. It was given further tax powers in 2012. It was given borrowing powers It could regulate a variety of other things like air weapons and drink driving limits, which are then different in Scotland than they are to the rest of the UK. And this followed what was known as the Calman Commission. And so Scottish devolution, again, has got it's really strong elements of success, but if you're looking at what it was aimed at doing, then probably less so. Now, this is a big amount of change there. That would be go back to one of our key questions. And well, does it look like it's here to stay? Well, it would. I mean, almost it being inconceivable that this kind of stuff could be peeled back in Scotland. Is further change needed? Well, if you ask a lot of Scotland, particularly if they're in the SNP, then the answer to that will be yes, but that completely goes against why it was created in the first place. One of the problems created by all this is the West Lothian question. So Scottish MPs could vote on issues that didn't impact on their constituents. At one point, actually, Labour had a Scottish MP as Health Secretary, which was a bit weird because he would make policy that didn't apply to his constituents. So that is an issue. So that the West Lothian question is something that the Labour government couldn't really solve, and we'll see some issue, an attempt to solve it by the Conservatives later on. It's a bigger issue for a Labour government actually, because a Labour government is likely to be dependent on Scottish votes. So it is a real problem, and you can see the conflicts in it. You don't really want two different types of MP, but Scottish MPs shouldn't really be voting on things which are devolved matters. Welsh MPs shouldn't be voting on things which are devolved matters. The Scottish Parliament is elected by the additional members system. Again, worth watching other videos I've done on electoral systems to get more of an idea on what that is. And again, it's fairly proportional. Works reasonably well in terms of Scottish elections. We've had majority governments, we've had minority governments. We've got the Barnett formula, which goes back to 1978. That means Scotland receives more money per head than England by a considerable distance, and it's the same in Wales and particularly in Northern Ireland as well. So England doesn't do particularly well out of that, but the other states do. There was devolution in Wales. Now support for this was lukewarm, to say the least. The vote turned out 50.3% yes, 49.7% no. The turnout was just over 50%, so just over a quarter of people thought, yay, Welsh referendum, Welsh devolution, that's a really good idea. And they got it. So a slightly odd one with that. Now, it was called the Welsh Assembly. It is now called the Welsh Parliament, but it was it was the Assembly. And you can see with the less strong support why it had less power. So it had control over several areas, including health and social services, agriculture and fishery, and local government and transport and fire service and housing, environment, culture and sport. Now, notably, it doesn't have control of criminal justice. It doesn't have the tax-bearing powers or the borrowing powers that are held by the Scottish Parliament. It also uses the additional members system, which again gives a degree of proportionality. It's not as good in Wales given proportionality because it's smaller, and so there's less of that proportional element. We also see devolution in Northern Ireland. This was a massive breakthrough. This was something that was really, really important because we see the Good Friday Agreement, and that brought together the Unionists and the Nationalist communities in an attempt to end the Troubles, and there was this huge tension between the two communities. It uses a single transferable vote to ensure that the communities are proportionally represented, because there's huge problems in Ireland previously where there'd been gerrymandering and there'd been the Catholic minority had been massively underrepresented in government. And this also was set up to bring about the power sharing in the executive in Northern Ireland. The government is headed by a First Minister and a Deputy First Minister, and the idea is that one represents one community and one represents the other, and again is to do with the unique history of Northern Ireland. And the Northern Ireland Assembly has control over corporation tax, over health, over social services, over agriculture and fishing, again over the environment, over local government, over transport, education, sport, tourism, and very, very importantly, over criminal justice. And the idea again here was to unite the two communities. Now, it has had a difficult history since it's been in place, because getting agreement between these often very different groups with different agendas and not necessarily a huge amount of trust between them has been very, very difficult. And so there are periods of time when it just ceases to function and collapses. But again, it looks like it's here to stay, and things are definitely better than they once were because of, in particular, the Good Friday Agreement, but the creation of the Assembly in Northern Ireland is a really important part of that. Now we also see ideas of electoral reform. So we've seen more proportional systems come in. So we've got the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments using the additional member system. We've got Northern Ireland using the single transferable vote. We've got European Parliament elections that are using regional lists. We see the supplementary vote system being used for London mayors and other institutions. So we have seen electoral reform. And so interestingly now, the UK isn't just purely first past the post. It's first past the post for general elections, but this is the beginning of electoral reform. Now, all of these systems are more proportionate or majoritarian, and therefore more likely to give a clear view of the population than first past the post, which is the traditional one, which is still used in general elections. In '98, there was a report commissioned by Roy Jenkins into possible reform to the electoral system in the UK as a whole. Now, he recommended a shift to AV plus for a general election, which would mean a great deal more proportionality, extended voter choice, maintain the links between MPs and their constituencies. For most, but not all, about 80–85% of MPs would be elected using alternative vote, where the candidates are ranked by the voters, and you have to have got over 50% to win that constituency. If no one does, then whoever came last, their votes are then redistributed. So if you've ranked them number one, but somebody else who's higher up the list is number two, then your vote will go to whoever you rank number two, and that keeps on going until someone's got 50%. And again, that should mean that the majority of the people in that constituency have shown some kind of preference, whether that was first, second, or third for whoever then wins. And then there's a regional party list system, and the rest of the seats are calculated by that, and there would be some kind of system put in place to make sure that worked fairly in terms of the overall proportions. Would have been lovely. People didn't want it, however, and in the Labour Party, I mean, particularly, you can't blame them for this. They'd won a huge victory using first past the post, so they carried out the commission. Roy Jenkins came back and said, this is what you should do, and they didn't do it. So here we can say, well, there's an argument that we need further reform. If we don't like the electoral system, then they haven't gone far enough. So we haven't changed that much. You could argue there are new voting systems, but in the big one, the one that really matters, the Westminster elections, it's not been brought in. So the reforms they brought into the House of Lords, well, they ended the dominance of hereditary peers. So we see with this idea of democratisation, so that can be seen as part of it. And again, we can see it's maybe a bit party political as well, because the hereditary peers tended to be conservative peers and oppose anything Labour governments did historically. And only 92 survived the reforms, and they essentially had to show that they should be in the House of Lords for other reasons other than just birth. The House of Lords Appointments Commission, which is set up in 2000, nominates peers not linked to party, but the PM and other party leaders continue also to nominate. And we've got to the point now that the House of Lords is gigantic, and that there is lots of dubious things that continue to happen with large party donors have a tendency to get nominated and end up in the House of Lords. It did end the traditional conservative dominance of the House of Lords, and that can be seen as a step forward. But they were supposed to be the first step towards further reforms, and steps towards electing some of all of the House of Lords, and that would again been a move towards democratisation. That would have been a bigger reform. That would have taken things further. Now, the House of Lords, to many people, when it comes to the UK Constitution, is a significant issue still, to have this massive unelected body. Now, things have been done over the years to weaken its power, but it still seems odd in a modern representative democracy to have an appointed chamber of such unwieldy size without doing something to reform it. Another key issue that we saw at the beginning was that the Labour Party looked to do things to safeguard and improve people's rights, and what they did is they incorporated the European Convention of Human Rights into UK law. And this became the Human Rights Act of '98. It gave people rights, including the right to thought and expression, the right to assembly, the right to a fair trial, freedom from degrading treatment, freedom from discrimination, the right to privacy, and the right to marry and to family life. So loads and loads of fundamental, really important human rights, and they are there enshrined now in English law with the Human Rights Act. All future laws from this point had to comply with this act. In 2005, an exception was made for those suspected of terrorism in terms of their right to liberty and security with the introduction of control orders. And the Human Rights Act is something that, particularly with the UK leaving the EU, is in a tenuous position, really, and it is something that the Conservative Party have talked about getting rid of. So it was a big change. It was seen by many people and really welcomed by lots of people as a really significant step forward in safeguarding rights in the UK, which haven't really been safeguarded before. But its permanence can definitely be questioned. The Labour Party also created the Supreme Court in 2009. Now, this came from the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005, and the Supreme Court is the highest court of appeal in the UK for civil and criminal cases, except for criminal cases in Scotland, because Scotland has its own independent criminal justice system. It took over the role previously done by the Law Lords, who sat in the House of Lords, and so what we're seeing here is actually separation of powers have been improved, particularly because it reduced the power of the Lord Chancellor, who's now the Justice Secretary, who had actually been in all three branches of government, which is pretty mind-blowing and shows how poor separation of powers really were. So we've now got a split between the legislative and judicial branches. But following clashes in 2019 with Boris Johnson, for example, over the proroguing of Parliament, again, the future of the Supreme Court is in some doubt. So for democratic reasons, for separation of powers, this was a big move and certainly a move forward. Is it going to be permanent? Well, I think time will tell on that one. Again, because of the flexibility of the UK Constitution, and it can all be changed through Acts of Parliament, then we had the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005 that brought it in. We could have a Constitutional Reform Act which could take it out again. I think there would be quite a lot of resistance, however, to that change. Right. The coalition of 2010 to 2015. Now, because this is a coalition involving the Liberal Democrats, this means that constitutional reform remains on the table, because the Liberal Democrats are normally the greatest kind of pushing force behind constitutional reform. The Conservatives, you would say, are maybe not a natural party of devolution. But you have to remember, in Conservative ideology, it is the idea to change to preserve. So if they see institutions under threat, they're likely to bring about some kind of alteration to try and keep them in place. Right. So we have this vote in 2011 to give the Welsh Assembly greater powers. So it had actually proper law-making powers in all of the 20 areas that had been devolved to it. And they got a 64% yes vote. And now it no longer had to consult with the Westminster government. And in 2014, it gained control over stamp duty and landfill tax. And so we see this movement of the Welsh Assembly towards becoming what it is now, which is the Welsh Parliament, and it gaining more power. So again, this is an idea that devolution, once put in place, is going to be really hard to remove. And actually, the direction of movement in all the areas on this seems to be towards greater and greater decentralised for power, which decentralisation was set out by the Labour Party as one of its key aims and seems to be being continued into the coalition government. Now, this one is a kind of a highly controversial one, and if you're looking for a really good example of constitutional reform that hasn't worked, ta-da! Here it is. So the coalition set up the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Now, this is a big thing that Liberal Dems had always wanted, because it always seemed that a government had far too much power, because it could pick and choose when the next election was, and normally it would do it when it best suited them. So, for example, just after they'd made some huge tax cuts, or when the economy tended to be doing really well, or when the opposition was in the middle of a huge infight. So the Fixed Parliament Act was supposed to take that right away. So there was a 5-year fixed date for the next election, and for an early contest you required a 2/3 majority, or the Prime Minister losing a no confidence vote and no government being formed within 14 days. So as you can see, that we had the Fixed Parliament Act was set up in 2011, and then we had the 2015 election. So the next one was in 2020, except it wasn't. The next one was in 2017, and the one after that was in 2019. Now, one of the problems with this act is it's really easy for the Prime Minister really to bully the opposition into an election, because they kind of go, I think there should be election, and then the opposition go, no, they shouldn't, and they go, oh, so you want me to stay in power? You're not ready to take over. You're scared. Ooh, scared. And that's what May does in 2017, and to a point that's what Johnson does in 2019. He just kind of hounds the opposition, kind of going, oh, you're too scared. You're not strong enough to take an election. You don't think you could do a better job, and it's really hard for an opposition party at that point to get around and go, no, you're doing fine. Carry on. And so it seemed, I think, like a good idea. I don't think this one's going to survive. There is already plans in place under the current Conservative government to take this one off the statute books, and its long-term survival looks highly, highly unlikely, and it hasn't met its brief anyway. So it's been an absolute failure, and one, I think, that will be reversed. Other areas of reform then by the coalition government. Now, a lot of this, they just fought each other, and some of this is really quite sad actually, because there's some things that could have been some really positive reforms that got kicked out by one side or the other. So the Conservative backbenchers blocked the Liberal Democrats' push to change the House of Lords to make it mainly elected. I think it was 91 rebel Conservative MPs that blocked that. So the Liberal Democrats retaliated and blocked the Conservative plans to reduce the number of MPs to 600. Now, this would have actually made constituencies far more equal in size, and the fact that they aren't equal in size is a huge problem with democracy, and so this possibly would have been a good change, though it would have massively favoured the Conservative Party, which is why the Liberals as well has been annoyed about the lack of House of Lords reform, which is the other reason why they kicked it out. In 2011, the Liberal Democrats had wanted to reform the voting system for general elections, and they proposed the use of AV, the alternative vote, which is a preferential voting system. It wasn't actually the Liberals' first choice. They wanted STV, which is more proportional, but they didn't think that. They thought it was asking too much, so they asked for AV. They lost really badly. Vote turnout was really low. 68% voted against, and so we're seeing here a kind of lack of progress in constitutional reform, and it's coming to a kind of a grinding halt. The Conservative Party wanted to replace the Human Rights Act with the British Bill of Rights, but this was blocked by the Liberal Democrats. There was an independence referendum in Scotland in 2014. 55% of Scottish voters said no to independence, but they did lead to great calls for even greater devolution. So that story clearly wasn't over. And so, well, if devolution was to preserve, then what's happened since doesn't maybe suggest that that's worked, because there's just growing and growing demands in Scotland now for a further referendum. And a lot of this, it shows that maybe not everything is completely secure as it is. So we've got things like the Human Rights Act, which seem under threat. Whether voting systems will be looked at again, that's an area that you could definitely say there's a need for more reform. You could definitely say there's a need for more reform in the House of Lords. The next step might be Scotland leaving altogether as a potential thing, and we'll look at devolution in a later video. So further reforms taken since 2015. Well, the spec says we had to look at further devolution in Scotland, so we'll start there. So the following Lindy Ref, there's further powers being given to the Scottish Parliament through the 2016 Scotland Act, and the idea of the Conservative government was this would mean that everything would be over. It was led to what was close to, but not completely, devolution max, or Devo max is often referred to. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount further movement that could be made without actual going full hog to independence. Now, most significantly, the 2016 Scotland Act gave complete control over income tax in Scotland to the Scottish Parliament. It gave control over 50% of VAT. It gave control over a lot of the key elements of the welfare system and welfare benefits. and it gives them control over franchise rules, which does beg the question whether the right to vote in general elections for 16 and 17-year-olds might become a reality in Scotland. So devolution's gone further than Labour first intended it, both first of all under them, but then most definitively under the Conservatives. Now, neither Labour nor the Conservatives want independence, so they seem to be trying to starve this off. But actually, the more power that's been given to the Scottish Parliament, and therefore it's more opportunity the SNP has had to act independently, as shown, for example, through the COVID crisis, then actually that seems to have strengthened the case for independence rather than weakened it. So other major reforms taken place. Well, we've seen English votes for English laws. This is an attempt to address the West Lothian question I mentioned earlier. So bills affecting England or England and Wales can only pass with the approval of what is known as a Grand Committee. And this is either made up of English only or English and Welsh MPs, depending on what it's about. So it's first used for a housing bill in January 2016. Now, it's still not solved the West Lothian question completely, and it is starting to, again, feeds into the independence argument, because you're going, well, got these Scottish MPs, but they don't have the same rights as all the English MPs, and maybe this means actually that we've got a separate English Parliament, and it's starting to feed into that kind of narrative. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. Now, you could see how further reform could be done that meant that actually people were only voting on laws completely that affected them. Because in this one, then it could be passed by the Grand Committee but rejected by Parliament as a whole. So it's not completely solved the West Lothian question. The Recall of MPs Act, again, seems like a good step in the right direction. It gives a legal means in which MPs that have misbehaved rather badly can be removed, for example, if they receive a custodial sentence or are suspended for Parliament for more than 21 days, and 10% of their constituents sign a petition. This triggers a by-election. And before, you just were stuck. If your MP wouldn't resign, you were just stuck. They were your MP, no matter what they'd done or what trouble they got themselves into. So that does seem to be move forward, a kind of greater accountability and a bit of a greater democratic element. Again, could this be taken further? There was definitely examples, for example, recently in Sheffield Hallam, where the sitting MP essentially wasn't sitting, and we've had it where a lot of times in the last Parliament where MPs were elected under one party banner and then they changed parties, and again, at that point, should there be a by-election? So this is something where there is definitely an area for future reform, and definitely an area where things could change. I hope that's been helpful for you. There will be, again, ongoing videos in this section. So I'm now working my way through component 2. So I shall be moving on to devolution and then on to all the key parts of the UK government. Component 1 is already done. So if you're looking to do some revision on that, go through either my A-level politics playlist or find my component 1 playlist. I'm also working my way through the American component 3. So if you're looking for that and you're looking to compare to the US Constitution, you'll find videos in there. Thank you very much for watching. Please, if you've liked it, please hit the like button. If you've got any questions or comments, then please leave those in the comments section. If you haven't done so already and you're finding these videos helpful, then please subscribe and support the channel and help me make it grow. Thank you very much for watching.